answer. How do we define progress? How do we measure it? How do we guarantee it? How do we ensure that we hold government to account on their promises for environmental progress and ambition? And so what we're looking at today is the UK and the EU's framing of progress. We're looking at the practical steps that the UK particularly has taken to demonstrate progress, and importantly to embed that progress in policy and in legislation. And in fact, what steps it may have taken to demonstrate and embed regression in terms of our environmental policy as well. We're going to consider finally how governments and civil society might best work to safeguard existing protections and to further an agenda that's based on environmental progress. And as you'll see from the slide now, this webinar is also marking the launch of the EU-UK trade relations, why environmental policy regression will undermine the level playing field and what the UK can do about that, which is a research report which Professor Andrew Jordan, which you'll hear from in a minute, Vivian Gravey and Brendan Moore and Colin Reid from Brexit and the Environment completed for Friends of the Earth earlier this year. So we commissioned this report to really look at the framing of policy regression, to look at the forms it might take and to think about what we might do about that in relation to the EU-UK trade relations. So you'll hear a bit about that from Andy at the beginning, and then you will get a copy of that report, everyone who's here after the event. So we'll be hearing from Andy first on these issues. We'll have about 10 minutes from each speaker, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have time for questions, so please do put those in the chat. We will hopefully move on to questions at about 10:40, so we'll have about 20 minutes to have a bit more of a discussion. And if you want to indicate questions that you like in the chat, we don't have the ability to do any cunning voting, so feel free to just say, I second this question, and I'll make sure that those get answered. And after this session, as I said, we'll send out the report, but also some notes on the question and answer and any of the slides that you've seen here. So now to the experts. First up, I'd like to introduce Professor Andrew Jordan. He's co-lead of Brexit and the Environment, which is an award-winning ESRC-funded academic network seeking to understand what the challenges and opportunities are that Brexit raises for environmental policy and for governance. He's based at the University of East Anglia, and he also writes on climate change, governance post-Paris, is on a plethora of committees, and advises the government on environmental policy. So, as I mentioned, he's one of the co-authors of the report, and we'll be hearing a bit more from him now on ambition and regression in environmental policy. So, Andy.
Thank you, Kira, and thanks for the introduction. And thanks also for pointing out that this report has a number of co-authors as well. So you're quite right. I mean, the discussion about regression has really taken place in the context of the EU-UK negotiations. But what we're going to do today is highlight the fact that actually regression also speaks to much bigger debates at other levels of governance, at the international level, within the UK, and particularly at the devolved level as well within the UK. And I think we can all, in the environmental movement, think of lots of things we would like to do with regards to progression, but I think it's also important to bear in mind the meaning of the term regression as well, and be clear, I think, first of all, that regression can take many different forms, and that's one of the main headlines of the report. And it's important to remember that these different forms can take place and occur at different levels of governance. The good news, though, is that actually the government can do lots of things if it wishes to limit, reduce, or minimize regression. We talk about those as non-regression strategies. And secondly, the second bit of good news, I think, which emerges from the report, is that actually a lot of these things are Brexit neutral. They can be done by the UK right now. They don't depend on the outcome of the final negotiation with the EU, and they can be put in place and last for long periods of time. So yes, progression and regression are very much, should be thought about together. Most of my comments are really going to be focused on the UK level. I'm going to leave David to talk about the EU level, and Susan's going to say a little bit more about, hopefully, about the international level and also about the devolved level. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the report is structured into 9 sections. I'm going to dive in now and look in particular at sections 5, 6, and 7. So I'm going to identify the different ways in which policy can regress. Section 6, I'm going to talk about and introduce some of the ways in which regression can be minimized, some of the strategies that the UK can, if it wishes, employ to minimize regression. And then section 7, Friends of the Earth also asked us which areas of policy are most likely to be at risk of regression. We've tried to identify those. And so I'm then going to leave David and Susan to talk about some of the other sections in the report. So next slide. Okay, so when we think about regression, we're thinking about something that's distinctly different to policy progression. Policy progression is often about trying to develop new policies in ways that meet, strong environmental protection requirements and are pushed particularly strongly by environmental protection groups. Regression, on the other hand, is about removing, limiting, or diluting existing levels of policy. And therefore, it's a different sort of political process. And what we did in the report was to look at the existing literature on this, the literature which looks at different countries and looks at regression in different policy areas, not just the environment, but social policy, for example, as well. And there you find a distinction between 2 critical decisions that policymakers need to make. First of all, and these are portrayed on this 2x2 matrix, they need to think about whether they want to pursue regression in a low visible or hidden way, or whether they want to pursue it in a visible and open way. So that's the sort of left-right dimension in the matrix there, the text in red. They also, I think, need to decide, and this is the top-down sort of dimension, they also need to decide whether they actually want to actively pursue regression, do things to remove policies from the statute book, or actually whether they want to do nothing at all, in effect engage in a form of sort of benign neglect. So the way in which these 2 interact produces a 2x2 matrix. So let me start with the bottom right-hand quadrant, active regression. Now this is sort of classic sort of deregulation. It's removing existing protections from the statute book. Now, in theory, this is exactly what could have happened when the UK left the EU. All of that legislation that the EU developed over the last 40 to 50 years could literally have been removed at a sweep, but that didn't happen. But nonetheless, so that's a very pure form of regression. But nonetheless, there are other ways in which politicians, if they wish, can regress existing policies. They can defund implementing agencies, for example, or they can pursue it actively, but perhaps in a less visible way through the use of secondary legislation. But when you look at the existing literature, actually, examples of active regression are fairly sparsely distributed. Now, the EU has hardly really engaged in forms of active regression. So it's worth looking at some of these other quadrants to see how regression plays out in those as well. So let's move up to symbolic regression. Now here, politicians want to show that they're doing things, but perhaps they don't want to be very active about doing it. They want to be a little bit more stealthy. So they want to indicate that they believe what the people pushing deregulation are saying, but perhaps are a little bit hesitant. So we hear lots of deregulatory talk, the setting up of red tape initiatives, the setting up of bodies to check through the costs of regulation without focusing on the benefits. Now, we could say that actually a lot of this symbolic regression is just talk. It's not really influential, but I think nonetheless words do matter. And we've seen in the EU-UK relationships how just talking about regression can gum up the negotiations. It can also be a pretext to regression later on. It can facilitate regression in the longer term. And I think crucially as well, it can also provide a sort of facilitating context in which regression can occur. So I think should not be neglected. Let's now move to the bottom left, regression by shifting arenas. Again, this is really what Brexit's all about. You know, it's moving of policies from the EU level down to the national and the subnational level. And one way that policymakers can do that is by playing around with those arenas in a way that enables regression to occur. So I've already talked about, for example, secondary legislation where that can take place in a more sort of stealthy way. And also a lot of the debate around the Office for Environmental Protection is also really about, you know, the powers that policymakers will have in the future to oversee, to double check, to see whether regression is happening. If it is happening, to take steps to reduce it. That just leaves one final version, regression by default. And this is in many ways the most low profile and the most subtle of all, but nonetheless, it's important to look at. Now, essentially here, the risk of regression arises because nothing is being done with existing policies to update them to new scientific findings, to update them to new forms of technology. I mean, just doing nothing can lead to regression. Already we've seen risks of this raised in the context of Brexit. Brexit Environment published a report in May. We talked about regression by default, and there we referred to the fact that many of the review and revise clauses that are in individual items of EU legislation have not been maintained as they've been retained in UK legislation. So the risk is that these, as the Environmental Audit Committee pointed out a couple of years ago, that these existing retained items of legislation over time just date, or as the committee referred to it, zombify. So moving on to the next slide. So those are the different ways in which regression can occur. Now these, on this slide, we've identified some of the ways in which the government can, and we're focused really only on the UK government, can, if it wishes, take steps to address a regression. So let's go through the quadrants in the same sort of way that I did before. So let's start with active regression. So yes, the government can, if it wishes, to adopt strong and enforceable non-regression clauses in its trade agreement with the EU and all future trade agreements. It can also embed those in cross-national, i.e. pan-UK legislation as well, by working together with the devolved. It can also do it by making a very clear, possibly even legal commitment to policy progression, to maintain the continual improvement in environmental policy standards. And it can also, if it wishes, ensure regular UK-wide reporting and parliamentary scrutiny, so that there is, you know, constant oversight from bodies such as the OEP and also from Parliament as well, to see whether there are examples of regression taking place. What about symbolic regression? Well, we've seen a lot of this, I think, particularly in the period since the end of January, when the UK left the EU. We've heard about debates about, you know, new counting and policy reforms to the planning system and so on and so forth. I think here's an opportunity with Brexit for the UK to adopt a new philosophy, a UK-wide strategy of better environmental regulation. You know, what will regulation actually look like in the future? How will it, you know, absorb and take on board new scientific findings? How will it adjust to regulation and to changes in technology in the future? And there could also be opportunities to commit to regular reporting and monitoring to UN bodies, to the OECD, and perhaps also to the European Environment Agency as well, which the UK can, if it wishes, maintain associate membership of. Moving now to the bottom left, the shifting of arenas. Yes, there's an opportunity with post-Brexit for the UK nations to work together much more closely, to come to a shared understanding of what they mean by environmental progress, and also to adopt coordinated strategies to address regression as well. So yes, not just common frameworks, but common frameworks that hinder and limit regression. And then finally, we've got regression by default, the top left. So yes, it's about ensuring that individual policies continue to be updated and revised and reformed. That can be done at the level of individual policies by ensuring that they have evaluation and revision clauses clearly embedded within them, that there's a body overseeing that, possibly in the Office of Environmental Protection. But it's about having a broader system for ensuring that all of that retained legislation is not left to sort of wither on the vine, that it's regularly updated. And that could be perhaps be analogous to the system of fitness checking that the EU has developed, largely at the UK's bidding at the EU level over the last 20 years or so. So lots of things that the UK can do if it wishes to combat regression. So let's just move on to the final slide. So we were asked which of the areas in which regression is most likely to occur. Well, of course, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't know with any certainty what's going to happen. And so we tried to answer it in a kind of as evidenced a way as we possibly could. So I think one area one way of answering the question is to look at the sorts of policy areas that the EU itself is particularly concerned about. And I'm sure David will say more about this later on, but there are mentioned in the EU's draft trade agreement, 10 areas that are mentioned there: EIA, SEA, the nature directives, water and things like that. That indicates what the EU's worried about. So the second way of answering this question is to look at the sort of areas where the UK has struggled in the past with legislation. I'm thinking of the areas where the UK was defaulted from EU standards and ended up in front of the European Court of Justice. Now, crucially, all of these areas don't relate to product standards, things like waste, cars, chemicals, things that are traded across borders, but things that reside often behind borders. So things like the nature directives, EIA, water policy. These were the things where the UK tripped up in the past and which in theory could be at particular risk of regression. And then finally, the third way in which to think about the areas that are most at risk are to think about the areas that have been particularly targeted in the past for, particularly by deregulatory talk. And it's often, yes, been the EIA directives, the nature directives, and some of the water directives as well. So if I was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, but I would suggest that, the areas of planning, EIA, nature protection, and water are, I think, particularly at risk of regression. So to conclude, so regression can actually take many more forms than we often think about and are aware of, and it's important to be aware of the ways in which these different forms interact. I think the strategies to limit non-regression could occur within all of those four quadrants, and in many ways should try and build upon and support one another as much as possible. The good news is that there are lots of anti-regression strategies that the UK can adopt. It doesn't have to wait for an agreement with the EU or indeed for any other trade agreement with any other country as well. And then finally, this is not just about policy. Policy regression also speaks to a much broader debate about governance and institutions, because policy regression is very much dependent on the context, the governance context in which the government is pursuing policy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. I think that's a really great run through of a report, which I can assure everyone has a lot of further detail in it. But what that does really unpack is the different dimensions of regression. The fact that regression is not always something obvious and overt and visible and active, but the extent to which it can be passive, be long term, be quite insidious, and I think it's really interesting, before we move on to David, to think about how, as you say, the EU has flagged some of these areas where we're already seeing some of that lower visibility regression in the text for the future relationship. So what that says about the UK's possible future policy regression in areas like water, like nature protection, like environmental impact assessments. And how we see that already coming out in terms of the areas that the EU is looking to protect within that text. So I think it's a really good time to move on to David Baldock, who's a senior fellow at the Institute of European Environmental Policy, and his specialist areas include, helpfully, EU strategies for climate, for natural resources, and public investment. So he may be able to shed a little more light on the EU-UK future relationship side of this, and on how future UK regression, or indeed hopefully progression, might be best guaranteed by the future relationship and through EU action. So David, if we could move on to you.
Thanks, Kira. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Andy, for outlining the different shades and types of non-regression. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the difference between the two sides and where that might go. Both the EU and the UK, in principle, accept that there should be high environmental standards, and we've heard that a great deal. The UK is not against non-regression. What it is in favour of is a relatively limited form of non-regression, very, very similar to what is in the EU-Canada trade agreement, CETA. Essentially, that would require both sides not to regress in order to benefit either trade or investment. So in other words, it tries to outlaw forms of regression which are designed to give you some kind of economic advantage. Now, you could say that's probably not the easiest thing to prove, and B, you'd be right, because the history of disputes in this area indicates it is very difficult to prove, and this is one reason why such provisions have gone out of common use, and the EU has been looking for more implementable and more ambitious forms of non-regression. It's not simply picking on the UK, it's just saying this mechanism, as happens, isn't really a credible protection to anybody. And I don't think we've seen any special defense of it from the UK side saying it is credible, it does really work as a form of regression. The EU side also clearly has a number of concerns, most of them fairly obvious: not to have the standards in the EU undercut economically, in the sense of being having EU producers working to higher standards, shouldering higher costs, and then being undercut by UK producers at a lower standard. But I think there's also a political dimension to this. The EU wants to protect a high standards culture. It's embodied in the treaty, it's embodied in the whole vision of the future of the EU. The European Green Deal is about a more ambitious approach to the economy. It very much wants to implement that not only in climate, but across the piece. If you look at the biodiversity strategy, for example, it's quite an ambitious document. So it doesn't want to have a neighbour which is not on side with that, essentially potentially chilling the political impetus behind it, potentially giving comfort to sceptical member states who don't really want to go in this way, and can point to the UK saying, well, they're not doing it, why should we? So there's quite a substantial political environment behind that, and of course that could come to a head with the European Parliament, which has to ratify any UK-EU deal, and they've repeatedly underlined their interest in the level playing field and the environment level playing field in particular. So the EU is serious about this. It's not just picking something up which is designed to tie the UK into the past, which is the way it sometimes comes across at the UK end. So what does the UK want? Well, they want the weaker form of non-regression, as I mentioned already. And the reasons for this seem to be about, firstly, notions of sovereignty and self-determination, the whole sense of, I think George Eustace said in a letter to the House of Lords, not binding ourselves to the legislative systems of the past. I don't think that's quite what non-regression does, but that's what it obviously feels like to a number of people, and I think that explains some of the resistance to it in the UK. There's also more specific elements of the UK's position, a total allergy to any role for the ECJ, and that could come up in disputes procedures we can talk about in a minute. The UK has always been an advocate of trying to focus more on outcomes, not necessarily on processes. And this goes back for decades, a UK preference for saying, well, let's specify what the environmental standard is to be attained, and not necessarily bind people into the same processes. But actually, in many cases, legislation has been quite successful because it does bind member states into processes. You can then enforce those requirements. They're visible, they're transparent, and you can adjust them over time. And a lot of EU policy is essentially developed on exactly that basis of trying to specify processes. And that can be irksome to some degree. It can be slightly imperfect. You know, it's not necessarily going to totally minimize costs for all players, but it actually works as a system, and it's transparent, and it does provide a reasonable playing field. And I think when we see what's happening in the UK around climate, some of what we're adopting is very much in that direction. So I don't think the UK is totally lost in the past. There's certainly room for some discussion. The EU is totally lost in the past. There's room for discussion about this. But this sort of allergy towards process standards, I think, is problematic. The UK also doesn't like the EU's suggestion of having a dynamic element in non-regression. So the EU proposal on the table is that standards should remain the same at the end of transition period. Also that there should be a so-called ratchet mechanism, whereby if both sides increase their standards in the same area voluntarily without compulsion, they shouldn't then regress back from those. So it's not onerous in that sense. And thirdly, the EU wants to have a progressive element in the sense that there would be a forum where both parties got together and discussed issues where they could work together. And there are measures like the Industrial Emissions Directive, for example, which makes a great deal of sense for standards to be developed by parties working together and not totally separately. And I think everyone involved in this field agrees with that. It's just a question of how that's framed. The other side of this is, you could say the UK does want to regress in a strict sense, in that, first of all, we've heard certain noises. I mean, Andy's, I think, rightly identified the areas where these noises have been loudest. We've certainly heard this around Water Framework Directive and whether or not the UK wants to stay with the targets under that. And it's not clear at all from the present text of the Environment Bill that the OEP will have exactly the powers that are envisaged in the EU's version of non-regression. Can it really achieve the remedies required? I mean, that's still an open question. We haven't got to the end of the Environment Bill, but it's certainly not 100% assured at the moment. And similar issues apply to the environmental principles and other aspects of the Environment Bill. And also, and Susan might say more about this, the UK has in practice given more priority to the timetable for exiting the EU than for actually sorting out some internal measures, including framework measures inside the UK to get the 4 countries aligned. We simply don't have those agreements in place yet. So the UK isn't actually in a position yet to implement a fully non-regression thing. Finally, just to say where we may go is, according to press reports, the EU might accept an approach whereby both parties commit to certain principles, and then there's a strong disputes mechanism, whereby any regression which either party wanted to pick up could be taken to through a process where there was a binding outcome. And so we may see more about that, and we can in future. And we might want to pick that up in the discussion. The UK and the EU have different ideas of how environmental provisions in the agreement should be enforced. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks very much, David. I'm hesitating. I'm trying to find some optimism there in my notes to reflect upon, and I have found very little, and I sense I may find even less in Susan's presentation now. There is clearly a huge issue here around the UK's approach as a Westminster government to regression, and to its approach to how that might be guaranteed through international law, and indeed how domestic law might interact with ambition or regression, both at a UK level and in terms of the devolved nations. So I will now pass on to Susan, who may well be able to solve all of this for us, or at the very least provide us with more problems to consider. After Susan, we will move on to any questions. So if anyone does want to get those in the chat box now, then do feel free. So Susan founded Scottish law firm Living Law in 2013. She specialises primarily in international law in the field of the environment, public law, energy law, and human rights, and is a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a participant in the UN Harmony with Nature initiative. So hopefully Susan will be able to bring us back to the national context and give me a bit of joy.
I will certainly try to. I think we're definitely not in the position of a fait accompli yet, so that's certainly the kind of first takeaway message. I've got the slides there that we can hopefully share after the event today that'll just give a bit further explanation about who we are and what we're trying to do. But as Kira has mentioned, I work quite heavily at the moment on international law issues, and I think it's quite important to ground some of the debate that we're having in the UK within that much wider context. Basic principles, we've left the EU, that debate has passed, but we've certainly not left the world order. And I think that the message to ministers has to be very clearly put that compliance with the environmental rule of law is non-negotiable. Regression is simply not a real option for any government in the long term. I think Professor Jordan has obviously set out very helpfully the number of different ways that kind of regression can happen. I would add a kind of additional category of Jenga regression, which is some extent what seems to be happening at the moment, whereby we're almost removing different pieces of the puzzle without any clear view about how they're being replaced. But all ministers ultimately have to comply with the rule of law, and that certainly includes international law. So in terms of very basics, again, the UK is a founding member of the United Nations, permanent member of Security Council. Intrinsically to notions of sovereignty as a legal concept is actually a duty of cooperation, both from a perspective of the UK and the EU itself, and that's recognised in the UN Charter. But we also all have a right to a healthy environment, and that exists now already as a matter of international law, including human rights law. And this is not only about the European Convention on Human Rights. For sure, that right may be nascent, but I think there are key discernible elements of it that we can already see from looking at case law across the world just now. And I think these are very helpfully summarised and set out in the Framework Principles document, which was put together by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. So simply put, whatever the government's position may be, neither the UK or the EU have full regulatory autonomy, albeit that the EU has been at the forefront globally in recent years in driving international ambition forward. That may not always be the case. And national sustainable development goals, that's ultimately where we're trying to get to. Obviously as well, big focus previously in terms of climate debate, but there's starting to become this greater awareness now that the nature crisis needs to be treated with the same degree of seriousness as the climate crisis. I think nature is again increasingly being recognised at an international level as a matter of international peace and security by all states globally. This has obviously been driven home quite significantly by COVID. It's not just about protecting one species or another, and actually also recognition that's emerging around the right to biodiversity, because simply you can't deliver on the rights to water, food and health which exist at an international level without due recognition of the importance of biodiversity. And then at state to state level, we think about transboundary harm, often in terms of what comes out of the stack of one industrial plant, for example. But again, a lot of the academic thinking is now showing how duties of no harm and also around due diligence and things also already encapsulate diffuse and aggregate sources of harm. So if there are substantive failures in environmental regulation, such as in the event of a no deal, these will come into play. And again, from the examination that we've looked at of non-regression as a principle of international law, Professor Michel Prieur has written extensively on this subject. Non-regression can be seen as elements of customary international law, and particularly in the field of human rights. But in the analysis that's been done by Michel Prieur, non-regression is actually also intrinsically tied to notions of progression because of the need to adapt to developments in scientific knowledge. So on that point, I would very much echo what Professor Jordan has said. And ultimately, sending any other message around these issues internationally is deeply damaging and dangerous move for the UK's interests and for national security, because as has been said throughout this debate, it's these duties which protect the UK's interests. For example, when we're talking about nuclear plants being built in other countries, for example, they're what allow us to engage in debates and place constraints effectively on the exercise of sovereignty by others. So ecological crisis, obviously we know, fast changing picture. There's now 1 million species at risk of extinction, but we can do a lot. But the debate overall needs to be shifting much more, regardless of the Brexit context, to match the developments that are happening in science and around Earth system science, recognising the interconnectedness of different planetary boundaries like climate and biodiversity. And none of these problems can be solved by any one state acting alone. And just in the last few days, obviously, there's a lot of talk around the upcoming COP around biodiversity, and a lot of very encouraging moves towards progression. Yes, that is not yet matched in the domestic law, but I think it's important to emphasise Brexit's not going to be the only or last word. It does appear that finally there is a global step change and understanding that is emerging. So kind of coming back to closer to home in the devolved context, obviously some of what's happening is unfortunately not great news. I think in some respects the power grab that we had predicted from the outset is more significant perhaps and more aggressive than some people may have predicted. Overall, there are serious concerns about the internal market bill. It is contrary to democracy in my view, and also the rule of law. And I think it's fair to say that Scots won't necessarily accept these changes lightly. For any political leader, there are serious risks of this to the Union if proceeding contrary to the Sewell Convention. And obviously, we could talk for this entire session just about the contents and detail of that bill. But it sets up basically because when the UK leaves the EU, the devolved powers will effectively have no constraints on the exercise of those powers from the EU, and they could then set up their own systems on issues like food safety, and effectively what this bill is doing is re-centralising much of the power to Westminster. It reserves competence over state aid subsidies to the Westminster Parliament, and it gives the UK new spending powers in relation to devolved areas. It doesn't prevent the passage, obviously, of Scottish law, but it significantly impedes how effective they will be. And it includes this idea about mutual recognition and also non-discrimination. But in terms of the way that the mutual recognition principle is being introduced, it doesn't mirror how that has kind of operated previously in the context of the EU. So, I mean, I think ultimately the often cited example that we're talking about here is that if there is a trade deal that's done with the United States, which does allow the import of chlorinated chicken, for example, that these proposed measures would basically mean that those products would have to be able to be sold within Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And albeit that ministers have continued to say that they would do no such deal, that hasn't been reflected in the domestic law. More broadly, in terms of the environmental agenda, obviously the mood music has always been slightly better north of the border, and some of that is facilitated just because of the fact of being a smaller nation and it being more easy to get agreement between the Environment Department and Energy, for example, on cross-cutting issues. And it has been a much more measured, realistic overall debate, but there are still a lot of practical challenges, and it's by far from a perfect picture either, particularly when you're getting down to the day-to-day level. We're seeing a lot of increased politicisation of the work of scientific agencies, and also long-standing failures to deliver properly on things like access to information and access to justice. And again, overall, we need to move far beyond these traditional approaches. For sure, the First Minister has shown leadership, and I think in quite particularly difficult circumstances, but equally we do not need to wait for the work of the Human Rights Leadership Group to do what Scotland should already be doing as part of the Scotland Act 1998, again recognising the specific limitations there on the vires of ministers by virtue of human rights. So then looking at the continuity bill in a bit more detail, obviously now this is kind of a lot more of a political statement than perhaps a legal one. That's especially so by virtue of the design of the current internal market bill. In some senses, this could be seen to be by design. It's set up quite a clear standoff between independence and Westminster Parliament. But again, as we said, Scottish ministers have constraints on devolution in respect of the environment already under the Scotland Act. Overall, the proposals here for Environmental Standards Scotland and the retention of some environmental principles are overall welcome. Obviously, we'd want to see it going quite a lot further, and the rhetoric isn't, again, matching what's being set out in terms of the legal ambition there. But a lot of this, again, there is an inherent difficulty in trying to recreate these multi-level governance kind of concepts within a narrower domestic setting. I think Environmental Standards Scotland as a concept has some really positive potential to try and drive better upstream compliance, really trying to get in and work with senior people in local authorities and a cross kind of government approach to the environment being a priority. But I think what we're seeing is that it is unlikely to be sufficiently well resourced, and overall is definitely going to have a lack of independence, which in some senses is a concern that it actually can become a barrier and start to lock out public participation and access to justice if it's too aligned with a government's approach. And I think overall, aside from these legal difficulties, it goes back to the primary issue being the need for joined up working across the UK on key environmental challenges, where devolved and reserved matters have historically interfaced. A lot of the easy wins have already been made in Scotland around the environment, and we're looking at issues where powers are reserved on transport or energy and things like that. But we don't want that to become a lowest common denominator approach, which is obviously the serious risk that the IM bill poses. And overall, we need to try and get the disaggregation of the environment from being associated with the independence debate, because that could take 10 years or more to play out, and what happens immediately in the next couple of years is really going to be what's important for the environment in the long term. Overall, I think now's the time to speak up, as David Attenborough said, and what happens next is up to every one of us. Brexit's definitely not the last word, but equally we can't underscore how important it is that we do everything possible to try and uphold key safeguards, particularly around access to information and access to justice. We might not get all the answers, but some of the governance questions are central to how those will be determined in future. And again, it kind of goes back to, this is back to Brexit again. Some of what we're saying today is definitely not new. And I would definitely agree with what Professor Liz Fisher had said at a much earlier stage of this debate, that the Environment Bill highlights the importance of legal imagination for creating post-Brexit environmental law. So how do we actually try and do that? Well, obviously now time is extremely short, and there's going to have to be a prioritisation between the immediate term and long-term issues, also looking to what's happening and changes internationally. As a movement, I think there's a lot to be done in terms of learning the Brexit lessons, how we actually got here. Overall, the UK, in my opinion, has a fundamental democracy problem, and I think there's a lot more that we can all do to ensure that NGOs and civil society organisations better reflect diversity, because that's also kind of essential and vital to notions of legitimacy. And I think we've already actually seen a lot of progress and changes on that, particularly post some of the Black Lives Matters movement coming from the US. I'd also emphasise that, in my view, this is all central to promoting the debate about environmental rights overall, because they are all our rights, and recognising this rights-based approach is not a suggestion as a replacement in any way for regulation. I think sometimes that's a concern when we start to talk about environmental rights, but how does that actually fit within a framework which has such a detailed and, in some respects, heavily developed technocratic environmental regulatory structure traditionally. But I also think we can continue to do a lot about building coalitions, and particularly across movements, standing united in solidarity with other groups, particularly on human rights. There's a lot of opportunities for greater collaboration and learning in both directions, and also from the past. And I think some of that has been very much driven home to me by the conversations that I've had with more movement-based lawyers in the United States, for example, and it's really vital at this time. So in terms of the immediate priorities, again, obviously the Law Society has made it very clear that it's opposed to the measures in the Internal Market Bill, and particularly where they are allowing for a breach potentially of international law, and how deeply harmful that would be to the UK's global reputation. I think I perhaps didn't expect to see such a kind of campaign from the Law Society, and it's a kind of testament to just how serious the position that we have arrived at is constitutionally, that they are making that very clear and bold move. I think there's also a lot that civil society can do around drafting model laws and contracts for nature exercising democracy. Obviously, litigation is not going to go away, but it does need to be very carefully considered at this time, particularly the risks of negative precedent. But there's huge opportunities still for litigation, particularly around disclosure of information as and when needed. And obviously people like the Good Law Project have been instrumental in illustrating that, how powerful it can be to create a culture of accountability. And also, obviously Brexit has been hugely linked in with the financial issues, what's happening behind the scenes in terms of investor arbitration. That there's a lot of work that could be done there in terms of investigative activism around those. Supporting the judiciary overall is obviously another key message. But I think it's quite interesting when we're talking about the review that's being planned of judicial review. Actually, judicial review has often prevented many successful lawsuits in the environmental field traditionally, and when we're dealing with very kind of technocratic issues and courts not wanting to look in detail at those, that has often been what has withstood a successful challenge on the grounds of things like Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So has the government really thought that through? To be seen. And also a lot of other opportunity to continue to look at using other fora to continue to apply pressure and quasi-litigation interventions. Obviously the environmental movement in the UK has been pretty adept at doing that to date, and we've seen multi-level governance interventions around things like Hinkley Point, for example, where also the Espoo Convention was engaged alongside the Aarhus Convention, as well as domestic measures, etc. I think it might be quite interesting to see how diplomatically that position may change, and some of the appetite to really look at those more closely may come from other jurisdictions post-Brexit. Kind of moving on to some of the final messages about getting innovative and strategic with the law. Obviously, law alone can't solve the ecological crisis or the Brexit crisis, but I think it's more naive to think that we can address it without the environmental rule of law. I think it's also a myth that only complex laws are effective. I think there's a potential for very strategic amendments to still be made to the Environmental Principles and Governance Bill that can still deliver a step change. And ultimately, it's for the government to refuse to exceed those. So let's make them refuse to do it if that's the route that they want to go down. And I think particularly when we think about embedding things like consultation rules, we've seen that around coronavirus, for example, also Scotland tried to roll back quite significantly on its environmental information laws and has in practice done that. But the fact that the Scottish Information Commissioner was able to speak out about that and had the independence and ability to do that really nipped that in the bud quite quickly. And I think had he not been in the position that he had, we might have seen quite a different approach. So it's just an example about how important those kind of consultation obligations can be. And I think there's also the ability to continue to target non-environmental laws to deliver goals and progress for nature. Part of the issue that may face in the future is that in some senses, everything now is deemed green and clean. There's a lot of issues to do with false advertising, issues to do with greenwash, and analysing how we can use existing laws in new ways to tackle those. But just kind of touching finally on some of the more innovative developments that are emerging internationally, we published a report in June 2018 called Giving Nature a Voice, which was a comparative legal study and analysis of case law and developments around the world that we were able to prepare thanks to a very talented former intern who we had working with us at that time. And we developments in Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, New Zealand and India. For sure, rights of nature isn't a panacea either, but it could certainly be one tool in an arsenal to try and promote a move towards more ecocentric and less anthropocentric approaches to environmental regulation. And this debate has now taken off right across the world. We've got examples in the United States, but also now directly in the EU, where both France and Sweden have also recognised quite clearly in France in terms of the River Seine, and in Sweden as part of constitutional amendments. So this is a picture of us in 2019, where we presented this proposed amendment to the Swedish Riksdag, which is the parliament there, which the law was drafted to say that nature, including ecosystems, populations and species, shall be guaranteed the following rights and freedoms: the right to exist, flourish, regenerate, evolve and restore, and the freedom to exercise, enforce and defend these rights and freedoms. So again, it's not going to solve everything, but what we're looking at is potentially to have a strategic law which would perhaps provide an optic through which existing laws needed to be interpreted. So kind of getting to the conclusion, I think forewarned is forearmed. Obviously, we have known for quite some time that the government was not going to put non-regression into domestic law, and it's repeatedly failed to come good on the promises it's made. I've kind of tongue-in-cheek mentioned a little bit about Jenga regression, this kind of removal of different parts of the puzzle resulting in regression overall. And if ministers aren't going to do it, is it time to now do it for them? Can we kind of have some kind of cross-wide, cross-UK legal hackathon effectively over the autumn to deliver our oven-ready environmental solutions? Because the causes of Brexit are unfortunately not new or confined to the UK, but I think it may still be a moment of awakening for our movement and the turning point of in the long term. Because if we go back to our common future and what former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland had said in 1987, that these aren't separate crises, an environmental crisis, a health crisis, an energy crisis, etc. They're all one. And we also have Stockholm Plus 50 on the horizon, 2022. So let's keep the big picture in sight, working towards Earth system recognitions. And there is a lot of exciting global progress that's happening. I've worked in this field since 2007. And in that kind of short time, the UK has quite a long track record of trying also to cut red tape, even as a member of the EU, and going in full circle, realising that it wasn't actually red tape at all. What we need to work on is limiting damage in the short term. And I think there's little sign that a lot of what's coming from the government at the moment is being properly thought through, either in policy or even high-level ministerial terms. And legal certainty will only continue ultimately to lead one place, and that is before a judge. And I think regardless of the wider debate at the moment, judges will continue to keep on judging, but that uncertainty is for sure not going to be in business interests in the longer term.
Thanks very much, Susan. I'm aware that my my chairing of this has been poor on the grounds that up until the end there were few questions, and now there have been a small flurry. But I'm aware that we had promised to finish by 12. So what I'm going to suggest is that I offer the panel one final minute, literally one final minute, to provide some closing contributions on the couple of questions we had. And what I'll also do is circulate these questions to speakers and include any final thoughts in our follow-up email along with the report. So I think the key questions here are, number one, trade deals come with enforcement, environmental international law doesn't. So how at an international level could we hold the UK to account for any regression or divergence in international law? Anyone's free to give an answer on that one. Also, the UK is bad at cooperation, bad at ambition, and is generally taking some unhelpful steps. What do NGOs need to be do to challenge this overall framing and approach, rather than doing it piece of legislation by piece of legislation? And finally, devolution, does that necessarily represent regression, or are there more positive ways in which we could see devolved power as promoting ambition, and prevent the UK government pushing regressive measures onto the devolved nations? So those are the areas we've had questions on, and I'm literally going to give each of you 60 seconds to choose your favourite out of them and offer us a final conclusion, and then we'll be finished by 12:04. David, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Kira. Well, there are great advantages in binding legislative frameworks. The EU has managed to drive up standards because there have been binding requirements with enforcement procedures on member states, and that is a huge advantage over most international law, which doesn't have such mechanisms. And therefore, an effective non-regression clause in an agreement with the EU would be a huge step forward, and it would limit what was agreed by the UK with other countries such as the US. And similarly, a non-regression requirement of domestic legislation would help to reduce some of the hazards of the internal market bill, which have been flagged up here. And Green UK has written some helpful briefings on internal market bill on the environment side, if people would like to look at them, because there's several quite significant issues there. So I think we have to continue to try to not only get the governance inside the UK right, Susan's obviously correct there, but actually to implant an effective form of non-regression domestically and in the EU and elsewhere, and get the UK back on track, which should be possible to deliver on high standards. So let's try to make sure that's done.
Beautiful. Barely more than a minute. Susan, do you want to take one of those next?
Yeah, I could probably just comment a little bit on the point about cooperation. I think it's probably right that no country is perfect at cooperation, but that doesn't mean that we're going to stop pushing them to do it. And again, I think the issues about how you make that work are domestically about the channels and making sure that we have access to information and trying to really embed some good consultation obligations within the environmental principles and governance bill when it comes back. And I definitely agree that some kind of high level of ambition within the UK, that's what we're saying that we're signed up to. It doesn't have to be prescribed. It's reflected in the EU treaties as well already, but that would certainly ground and limit to some extent the issues with the internal market bill.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Susan. Andy, we will give you the final word. So we're going to have effective non-regression in the EU future relationship. We're going to prioritise cooperation, common frameworks and engagement across the UK. Give us some optimism to end on. How are we going to hold the UK to this ambitious narrative in under 60 seconds? You're on mute, Andy.
Sorry. To Ruth's point about international policies having equivalent or greater force than EU policies, I mean, that's actually mentioned in the report itself as an example of symbolic regression. It's deliberately confusing the matter. So yes, a lot of EU legislation adds greater substance and greater legal force to international policies, particularly in these key areas of EIA, planning, and of the nature directives as well. Haf's point about, is devolution necessarily regressive? Well, no, not at all. No, I mean, there are lots of countries of the world which have systems of devolution in which the different lower levels of government compete with one another in a race to the top. So no. But perhaps the form in which it's being enacted in the UK at the moment is potentially leading to regression for all the reasons that we know about. You know, the low levels of governance, that devolved nations are not likely to participate in the international negotiations, and because of the way the internal market bill is likely to work through, are going to be limited in their ability to innovate. The good news, I think, is that looking at regression in other parts of the world suggests that, yeah, there are different forms in which regression can occur. It's those 4 quadrants. And if we only focus our attention on the bottom right-hand quadrant, on active regression, removal and the repeal of legislation, we miss so much. So there's actually a huge agenda here covering all 4 quadrants for NGOs to work on, for pro-environmental departments and pro-environmental actors to work on. There's a huge agenda here as part of the of delivering the full potential that Brexit's going to have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. I think that qualifies as ending on optimism. And for further optimism, as I've mentioned a few times now, we'll be sending out the full report following this webinar, so you can also look at the recommendations within that for guaranteeing ambition in the future. But right now, without any further ado, I will let you all get back to your lives. I'm pleased to say most people stayed with us for that extra 7 minutes, so clearly it was exciting enough to keep people engaged. But thanks very much, Professor Andrew Jordan, to Susan Shaw, and to David Baldock for their contributions. Thanks to those of you who submitted questions. And if anyone would like any further follow-up beyond the email I'm about to send you, then feel free to get in touch. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a lovely day.